with that, in the midst of great justice for all.
Go ahead and read the civility policy this evening. Speak clearly and concisely with respect for the time of others. Listen objectively, carefully considering the opinions of others. Understand the counterproductive effects of disruption, demeaning, and intimidating behaviors. Understand and respect the district policies and procedures, and maintain a respect for the rich history of the district and the efforts of others that served in the past. So thank you. We're going to start our special study session tonight with the Brown Act. We have our attachments, and we'll turn it over to Dr. Saxon.
Thank you, Ms. Jensen. As part of the overview of the Brown Act this evening for the special board meeting, we have AALRR partners, Ms. Lexi Davidson and Mr. Ronald Wankart. They are with us via Zoom to go ahead and facilitate this agenda item for the overview of the Brown Act this evening. So without further ado, Mr. Alex, if you could patch them through, we could go ahead and get started. Thank you.
Hello, good evening, everyone. It's so nice to see all of you, even if it's a little bit of a distance. As you know, my name is Lexi Davidson. I am a partner at Atkinson, Andelson, Moya, Rudin, Romo. And with me tonight is Ronald Winkart, also a partner with Atkinson, Andelson, Moya, Rudin, Romo. And we're here today to talk to you all about the Brown Act. And please bear in mind that if you have any questions, to feel free to ask them. Based on the way that I'm sharing my screen, it is somewhat difficult for me to see if somebody would be raising a hand, for example. So if you'd like to interject, you're welcome to do so and stop either one of us from speaking. So in any event, we're going to move forward with our presentation. As many of you already know, the purpose and the scope of the Brown Act is to give citizens of the state of California access to government agencies and to prohibit governmental decisions from being made in secret. In order to effectuate this purpose, the Brown Act requires that the actions and deliberations of the governing boards of local public agencies, such as the school district, shall be taken openly and in public unless there are exceptions to this rule. We also require that all meetings and deliberations, including discussion, debate, and the acquisition of information, are conducted in public and subject to public scrutiny, again, except when closed meeting exceptions apply. The Brown Act does not apply to meetings of employees of public agencies, such as staff meetings, administrative meetings, and other routine meetings that our district cabinet members and other employees engage in. Really quickly, we just wanted to mention that the meeting is defined by the Brown Act as a congregation of a majority of the members of the legislative body at the same time and place to hear, discuss, or deliberate upon any item that is within the subject matter jurisdiction of the governing board. A majority of the members shall not, outside of a duly noticed meeting, use a series of communications of any kind, either directly or through intermediaries, to discuss, deliberate, or take action on any item of business that is within the subject matter jurisdiction of the legislative body. And very shortly, we'll go through some scenarios of what does and does not constitute what we call a serial meeting. And separate conversations or communications outside of a meeting that occur with members of a legislative body are permissible so long as that person does not communicate to other members of the board the comments or positions of any member of the board. And board members need to limit their communications, particularly emails, to either a single board member or, as our preference and recommendation, to the district superintendent. Further, board members should not copy other board members, other than the superintendent in this case, or forward emails they receive from board members to other board members, again, other than forwarding them to the superintendent. since doing so may result in a majority of the board members receiving emails and thus violating the Brown Act. And at this point, I'd like to turn it over to Ron Winkart.
Well, thank you, Lexi. Can everybody hear me okay? So, what are some of the examples of what would be prohibited communication? So some examples, board member A sends an email to board member B responds to board member A and copies board members C, D, and E. If board member C responds, now you have a violation of the Brown Act. So it's very important, is what Lexi said, is to keep those communications direct through the superintendent and just respond to the superintendent. Another example would be if board member A, if we go to the next slide, sends an email to board members B, C, D, and E, and board member B responds to board member A and copies board members C, D, and E. That would be a violation of the Brown Act. So if we go to the next slide, basically as soon as 3 of the 5 board members participate in a series of communications of any kind to discuss, and that includes emails, text messages, even through social media, whatever it might be, to discuss, deliberate, or take action on any item of business within the subject matter jurisdiction of the board. So then that's when a violation of the Brown Act occurs. So, I mean, you can talk about your family, you can talk about the weather, but you can't talk about district business. So if we go to the next slide. So what is a serial meeting? You hear this term serial meeting quite often. And that's when you use a series of communications directly or indirectly through intermediaries. So that could be a member of the public, that could be a superintendent, an assistant superintendent. So you have to be careful that you're not using intermediaries to discuss, deliberate, or take action on an item of business that's in the subject matter jurisdiction. So if we go to the next slide, these next few slides are kind of illustrations of what we've been talking about. So in this slide, you can see board member 1 communicates to board member 2, then board member 2 communicates to board member 3 what board member 1 said. That's a classic violation of the Brown Act. If we go to the next slide, this is an illustration of when you reply to all. So staff sends information to all of the board members, and then board member 1 replies to all, and then you've got this serial communication going on. So you have to avoid any of that type of communication. So if we go to the next slide, you can engage in separate conversations outside of a meeting. So board member 1 can talk to board member 2, but you have to keep it to the 2 board members. You cannot get a 3rd board member involved. You can answer questions, you can provide information, through the superintendent, so long as you don't communicate that information to another board member. So it's important that that is just one-on-one communication. Once you bring in another person, then you've got a violation of the Brown Act. So if we go to the next slide, you can see that it's okay for staff to send out information to each of the board members. And then there's no further communication. That's just information that the board has for the next board meeting. That's not a problem. If we go to the next slide.
Question.
Yes, sure. Go ahead.
All right, so on this slide here, staff, we all get an email from the superintendent that's BCC, so we don't know who else. We got an email and we read it, and I see me, Ms. McCauley, and I'm BCC, and there's 4 others. I don't know who those 4 others are, but if I communicate directly back, so to prevent it going and making a mistake, is it best to create a new email directly to the superintendent and not be a reply to that?
Yes, you should not hit that reply to all button because you don't know who all those copies are. You should.
In the first reply, no, I don't want to reply to all, so I don't have to make that decision. some information from staff, and I wanted to comment or reply back, I wouldn't reply to this email. I would go create a new email directly to that staff member on that topic, so I know it was just for one-on-one. It wasn't, they were
Right.
going.
That's the safest way to go. Then you don't have to worry about inadvertently violating the Brown Act.
If I may,
Sure.
this is Ken. Staff knows since I hit this board that every time somebody makes a mistake and sends something out to all of the board members, I immediately bark back and say, you have to blind CC everyone, because the tech guys we have are pretty bright. They, when you hit blind CC, our system is set up to where you don't know who it was sent to. And you don't make the mistake of replying to all. Honestly, you're at work, you've got 15 million emails going on, and you hit reply to all. The big concern on my end is bias. It's not that we all discuss, I don't listen to half of what anybody tells me to say, but I don't want to develop a bias because I saw something and somebody else responded, I feel this way, I feel this way. I don't want those biases in my head. The function of it, I get that, but to Tim's question, if no one else is listed, except you can see that it's you, and you got it. If you don't see anybody else, when you respond, you'll only be responding back. And there's confidentiality clauses that go with holding the position of the superintendent office manager as Yolanda does. So your source is safe as long as you're not discussing. So that's been one of my sticklers, and staff always does, because the first time I see it, I come unglued. If I do that at work, I'll be fired.
So I think what I've done recently is I got those, and for me to feel comfortable, I see it, I read it, and then I create a new one, and I go directly back with a whole new, just a one-on-one email about that email that I got. Because I don't want to take the chance that I'm doing. I just create a new email directly to you, because that's the one I'm talking to. And I go directly back there. I don't reply to the thing. I create my own reply.
This gets particularly difficult if staff is trying to tell, let's say the superintendent has something that's happening right now that's very serious. There's a police response to a campus. There's a fire response to a campus. The campus has been shut down. You guys are very interested in getting the information to the board and then taking action. Us knowing is a formality. What's really happening is you have to be able to address the situation right there. But even then I'll say, guys, you've got to send a separate text. And I haven't had this problem with this administration, but you're in a hurry, you're trying to help people, and boom, it's little functional mistakes like that. I've not seen ill intent.
Mr. Winker, this is Eric Sawkins, Superintendent. If I could go back to Vice President Jorgensen's comment or concern about the all reply or reply to the sender. Technically speaking, when I send an email out to my board, they're BCC'd, CC my executive assistant, Ms. McCauley to my right. So even if Mr. Jorgensen sends a reply directly to the originating email, the reply only comes to me If it's an all reply, his response email will come to me as well as then to CC Ms. McCauley, not the other board members. I just want to clarify that piece.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I don't see a problem that way. I think Mr. Jorgensen was indicating that he went the extra mile and created a separate email just to be on the safe side, and I think that's okay. But what you're describing is fine, so long as when the board member responds, it only goes to you and Ms. McCauley. I don't see a problem.
Thank you.
So you're assuring that's what happened.
Correct.
The way you said it now, the way we're getting it now,
Is
that if
what
I just hit reply to that, it's just over to the two of you.
correct, and no one else.
Correction. Sorry to be such a stickler, but this is my world. If you hit reply, you will only reply to the superintendent. If you hit reply to all, you will reply to the superintendent and the executive assistant.
Correct.
Just a,
Yeah.
you reply.
It's an all reply. Thank you.
So I think you're okay there. Now, if we go to, and that's what that slide illustrates. Now, if we look at the slide that says not okay, what you've got here is you've got everybody communicating back and forth, with the staff. So you've got this outward communication, and then you've got people replying back to each other. So now you've got what you were concerned about, is that the reply is going back to all the board members. So that's just an illustration of what we've been talking about. And then if we go to the next slide, it's okay so long as it's just a one-on-one communication with the superintendent. And that's what, and you're not communicating what other board members have said. You're just sending out information, you're receiving information back, and then at the board meeting, you might share that information with the entire board. So with that, I'll turn it back over to Lexi. She's got the next slide.
I have a comment. Can we go back? Can we go back to that last slide?
Sure.
This is really important. The person in the middle is a staff member. That can be any staff member. So I happen to be at the football game. A staff member comes up and makes a couple comments, kind of wants to know how I feel about something as a parent and as a community member. And I relate that to that person. And it's very clear that I'm not at a board meeting and there's not 5 other board members. And then someone starts, that same person meets another board member and says, I was talking to them and they don't say anything about particularly what I said, but the topic matters. Staff has a right to be interested in what's going on in the district. But sooner or later, if you can see on here, this myriad of things says that the staff member, being good-natured and maybe got a question answered that would benefit others, the responding out into the community is very dangerous because you've just biased, number one, staff about a decision you haven't made yet. And number two, this creates a problem where the community says, I can't get anything from the board. I hope the takeaway here is that when people want to know what board members are going to do, and I've compared this organization, the structure, the constraints we have to other local organizations, and they don't have to worry about this kind of thing, and it's seen as productive, and it is productive if you want to deal with the residents of the community. But there are so many constraints on us, and you can see that mess right there describes it accurately. You can go with the best intentions, the next thing you know, 4 of the board members have talked to someone, they go out and make comments to others. I'm sorry, but yeah, this is trouble.
Well, it could be. If usually it's the superintendent who's involved, so the superintendent is pretty savvy and knows, what the requirements of the Brown Act are. I suppose you could have, let's say, somebody on the staff who's not quite as familiar with the Brown Act, and you're at a football game and you make a comment. Let's say it's the athletic director for the district. And so the athletic director shares what board member 1 said with board member 2, and then sees board member 3 and shares what board members 1 and 2 said to board member 3. That could be a violation of the Brown Act. Let's say the issue was the scoreboard needs to be refurbished on the football stadium. And so, board member 1, staff member says, do you think we need to refurbish the scoreboard at the football stadium? And board member 1 says, yes, I think that's a good idea. And then the staff member asks board member 2 the same question, and board member 2 says, yeah, I think that's a good idea as well. And then the staff person goes to board member 3 and says, hey, I talked to board member 1 and 2, and they're in favor of refurbishing the scoreboard. You've got a violation of the Brown Act. But it was the staff person who's violating the Brown Act, not so much the board members, but you still got a violation of the Brown Act. So there is the potential problem there. But when you're talking about, the superintendent, that's not likely to happen because superintendents are usually familiar with the Brown Act and know that, okay, I've got this information from board member 1, I've got this information from board member 2, I've got information from board member 3. Now it's time to bring this to the board meeting and discuss it at a board meeting. So Yeah, I mean, there's always potential for violation, and I understand your concerns. And so I think with just educating staff and continually educating staff, you can avoid these problems.
For clarification, in the example you just gave, there was nothing nefarious in there about what the staff member might be inquiring about. It's just one of those things that could happen, and the planets don't line up properly.
Yeah, no, I don't think it's nefarious. I think the athletic director in the example I gave is, just interested in refurbishing the scoreboard and, kind of wanted to get the lay of the land and see if there was support. But, they need to be educated that can't be done in that manner because that's a violation of the town. And I don't mean to pick on athletic directors, but that you gave that football stadium example, so that came to mind.
Okay. So moving on to the next topic, we want to touch briefly upon a legislative update that came about 13 months ago. This particular assembly bill was signed into law and amended this government code section. And the assembly bill and the new law indicates that certain communications involving a legislative body's members that occur on an internet-based social media platform do not constitute meetings under the Brown Act. So examples of that would be things like answering questions that are raised by constituents, providing information to the public, or soliciting public input on matters within the body's jurisdiction. And when we talk about this, we're talking about an individual board member having this communication with individual constituents, not involving another board member. However, the majority of the board, again, cannot discuss among themselves business of a specific nature within that body's jurisdiction, which, when talking about social media, encompasses things such as comments or use of digital icons that express reactions to communications. So things like the like button or the heart button on Facebook or an exclamation button or even the sad emoji. Any communications that are posted or shared on social media between members of the legislative body and or responses to the same communication on a social media page with things such as the use of emojis, the like button on Facebook or Instagram, or retweeting another board member's post on a platform such as Instagram. Board members also cannot directly respond to social media communications made, posted, or shared by any other member of the legislative body regarding a matter that's within the legislative body's subject matter jurisdiction. So what I like to tell people in this particular instance is that you can like the photograph of your fellow board member's granddaughter's second birthday party, but that's pretty much where you need to keep your like buttons and your emojis, because otherwise you could unintentionally engage in a serial communication through a social media platform. So we do have some exceptions to the definition of a meeting, such as individual contacts or conversations between a member of a legislative body and any other person are not prohibited. Although, again, as Ron discussed, those individual communications could become problematic if that person is having those communications with individual members of the board and sharing those comments with other individuals. The attendance of the majority of members of a legislative body at a conference or similar gathering open to the public that involves a discussion of issues of general interest to the public or to public agencies that are of the type represented by the legislative body are also not prohibited, provided that a majority of the members, when they're at that conference or similar gathering, do not discuss among themselves, other than as part of a scheduled program, business of a specified nature that is within the subject matter jurisdiction of the board. Another exception to the definition of a meeting is fairly similar. Again, the attendance of a majority of the members at an open and publicized meeting that is organized to address a topic of the local agency is not prohibited, provided, again, that the majority of the members do not discuss among themselves, other than as part of the scheduled program, business of a specific nature that is under the subject matter jurisdiction of the board. Some additional examples are attendance of a majority of the members at a purely social or ceremonial occasion, or attendance of the members at an open and noticed meeting of a standing committee of that particular legislative body. And then briefly, when we talk about open meeting requirements, again, we want to reiterate that all action taken by a legislative body must be taken in open session unless it is specifically authorized to occur in closed session. Action taken is defined as a collective decision by the majority of the members to make either a positive or negative decision, and it may also include a vote by the majority of the members. As you very well know, the Brown Act prohibits taking action by secret ballot and also prohibits us from restricting the broadcast of open and public meetings unless the public meeting has become disruptive, and we'll talk about that in a little bit. Please note that members of the public may record open meetings, provided that the method by which they are recording is not deemed disruptive. So, for example, there's not an obstruction of view, it's not overly noisy, or it is the recording itself is not acting to disrupt the meeting process. And with that, go ahead.
Lexi, when I first hit the board a few years ago, what we would see happening was there would be during board member comments, someone would say, you know, I got to thinking about this, and I think this might be a good idea. And basically, people were asking for consensus about something that was not on the agenda, and then mysteriously you would see it show up for an action item without discussion on the next agenda, and I found that horrendous. Any comments?
Well, what I would suggest is that typically what we see for board member comment when I've been in board meetings are things like, hey, we had a great time at the Vasquez High School football game watching the homecoming court come out into the field. It's so nice our kids are back after COVID, right? Something, or I attended this PTA meeting at Meadowlark and they were discussing these wonderful additions to the STEM program. Usually that's what we hear of, are things that are celebratory about the school districts, our kids, our community members, our staff members. We can certainly request items, the public can request items to be put on the board agenda. The board by a majority can request items to be put on the agenda, or a board member can ask for an item to be put on the agenda. But certainly what you're suggesting is that through board comment, we may have accidentally taken a poll we shouldn't have taken, and that an item shows up for action at a later date without discussion. So yes, I would strongly encourage against that type of activity.
So I would just add that if a board member is interested in a topic and they get a consensus, during board comments, that item should be put on the next agenda for discussion and possibly action. But there should be a discussion at the next board meeting, not not taking action without any discussion at all. The only thing during the board comments is asking staff to put something on the agenda for the next board meeting, or to bring information to the board about that item so that the board can discuss it and possibly take action on it.
While we're here, and then I'm going to be duct taped up, so I can't talk anymore. I think you know that I know the answers to these questions, but let's say that we have someone that likes to engage the board and ask questions, and we feel like, no, that's not appropriate. What I read wasn't appropriate. It didn't capture things properly. What would you say to the board when they feel that they have to respond to something coming off public comment? And so there's a fine line between being grossly unresponsive to bait that's being thrown out there. What would you tell me? Because I'm the worst at this.
I'll start and I'll have Ron supplement, and we do have a short slide on this moving forward. If an item is not agendized, we do need to make sure that we provide a very brief comment, if any, in response to the public comment. And very typically that comment can be something to the effect of, thank you for your information, or thank you for your concern. So in some occasions, we refer the topic to the superintendent for further review. or further information,
Yeah.
it's best not to engage in a conversation from the dais.
Yeah, you don't want to engage in a debate, particularly on something that's not on the agenda. You know, if somebody says something controversial or that's just totally inaccurate, you know, you could just respond by saying, asking the superintendent to provide that individual with accurate information about that topic.
Sorry, Eric.
That's okay. That's clarification. Appreciate it.
Thank you.
Ron,
Yes.
do you have any other questions?
Oh, I'm
Yeah, I'll let you take it back
okay.
over, Ron.
Okay, so we're on slide 24. Okay, great. These next series of slides are have to do with teleconferencing and open meeting requirements prior to the pandemic. What those requirements were in place prior to the pandemic. They're important because although we have legislation now, which we'll talk about in a few slides, that allows some flexibility, you have to adopt a resolution to implement those flexible provisions. So we'll talk about both because I think it's important to understand both in context. So this first slide talks about teleconferencing, which prior to COVID and prior to AB 361 was used under very limited circumstances. And what I've always told people when they ask about can we teleconference prior to COVID was you have to plan ahead. You cannot do this at the last minute because, as you'll see, there's a number of requirements. When you have a teleconference meeting, all the votes have to be by roll call. So if we go to the next slide, if you're going to do the teleconferencing and not adopt the resolution, you have to post agendas at all teleconference locations. So that requires planning in advance, and conduct teleconference meetings in a manner that protects the rights of the parties and the public appearing from the legislative body. So allowing them to participate and to observe the meeting. So if we go to the next slide, each teleconference location has to be identified and the new notice of the agenda meeting in each teleconference location must be accessible to the public. So that has to be planned in advance as well. So if you know, frequently we would get questions before COVID, board members ill and wants to participate from home in the board meeting. Well, usually that happens at the last minute or after the agenda is posted. So it's prior to COVID would be impossible to do. If we had advance notice, you know, let's say more than 72 hours notice, the practicality of it didn't work because you'd have to make that home accessible to the public and you'd have to post the agenda there. When somebody's ill, they don't want people coming into their home. Even when they're feeling well, they don't want people necessarily coming into their home. So that aspect of teleconferencing didn't work. And then a quorum of the board would have to participate from the boardroom, not not remotely. Those were the rules beforehand. And then if we go to the next slide, I think this was mentioned before. No, you can't take action by secret ballot, whether it's preliminary or final. You have to report any action taken in open session, and then prior to taking any final action, when you're talking about salaries and salary schedules for cabinet and superintendents, assistant superintendents, etc., and their fringe benefits, you have to give an oral report during an open meeting in which the final action is going to be taken. This is a fairly new requirement that's been added. So if we go to the next slide. Yes, a question.
So I want to use terms that we use here. You're using terms of it. So when you're saying teleconferencing, that's Zooming, like we used to do Zoom meetings, correct?
Well, teleconferencing prior to COVID, at least for me, I didn't even know what a Zoom meeting was until COVID hit. We used to just refer to it as teleconferencing, and people would call in. Usually wasn't by video, and we planned it in advance. So, for example, when we used it, let's say a board member was at a conference at a hotel. So we would arrange for a conference room at the hotel. We'd post the agenda. We'd make it accessible to the public, and the board member would usually call in, just audio into the board meeting. We didn't usually use video. And when we get to what's happened since COVID and with Zoom and everything, it's a lot more flexible. We'll talk about that and in a few slides. But the term teleconferencing, at least as I'm using it, is the term that was used. It's used in the Brown Act and it was used before COVID hit.
So, just so I think that I properly jumped.
I'm sorry, I didn't hear your last comment.
You are not referring to Zoom meetings as teleconference meetings.
No, I will refer them specifically as Zoom.
Separate functions that would create, right?
Yeah.
I think
teleconferencing is like someone we had a couple of years ago, we had a board member that we wanted to do it and they had to be there by phone. And so in that case, that's teleconferencing, which wherever that.
For sure. What you're describing, guys, you can hear me a lot better now because I have different microphones. The public is always saying they can't hear what we're saying. So be cognizant of your microphone. The question is this. Let's say that I don't want to participate up here with the other four, and I Zoom into the meeting from home. What that means is, if I'm going to be in my guitar shed, I'm going to post my guitar shed for public attendance so they can come and sit in my guitar shed. That's what they're saying. If we're all here radiating out, that's a whole different world. But if one of us is calling in on a telephone or Zooming ourselves into the meeting, it matters nonetheless. If you are participating outside of where everyone else is and out of the boundaries of the district, you have to post the address that you are and let people in if they want to show up there.
That's correct. That's correct.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, so this slide talks about providing the public with an opportunity to address the board at each teleconference location. And you cannot require members of the public to register or provide information or complete a questionnaire as a condition for attending the meeting. You can ask them, but you cannot require it. Okay, now the next slide is where we get into AB 361. And AB 361 was recently passed and recently took effect October 1st, and is basically an extension of executive orders that were issued by the governor when the state of emergency was declared due to COVID in March of 2020. And it provided much more flexibility in how you conducted public meetings. It did all of the things that we just talked about, teleconferencing and requiring public access to people's board members' location when they called into a meeting. Some of those are waived with AB 361. And so I'm going to be talking about some of those things as we go through. This allows, AB 361 allows boards to meet by teleconference without complying with all those traditional items that we just talked about: agenda posting, physical access, quorum requirements for teleconferencing. So as long as you've adopted a resolution declaring the state of emergency, then you can proceed under the more flexible requirements of AB 361. So if we go to the next slide. So during the state of emergency that was proclaimed by Governor Newsom due to the COVID-19, and that state of emergency is still in effect. It also applies if state or local health officials have imposed or recommended measures to promote social distancing. That's still occurring, or the board has determined by a majority vote that a meeting would present imminent risk to health or safety of the attendees. So that's in the resolution that most districts are adopting. So basically, You still have all three elements right now. You've got the state of emergency proclaimed by the governor. You've got restrictions imposed by state and local health officials. And so therefore, it follows that the board may decide that meeting in person presents an imminent risk to the health or safety of people who are attending. So that would allow the board to meet, and we've been using the word teleconferencing, but this now includes Zoom or any other similar method of meeting without complying with all the requirements. So if we could go to the next slide. So if the board does adopt a resolution and decides to go use the exemptions, and we have in the slide the word teleconferencing, because that's the word that's used in the AB 361 and in the Brown Act. But now when we talk about teleconferencing, we're including Zoom meetings and those types of meetings. The board has to still comply with other provisions. You still have to provide timely notice to the meeting. You have to post agendas as required by the Brown Act. You have to, in the agenda, indicate how members of the public can access the meeting remotely. So if we go to the next slide. So you have to allow members of the public to access the meeting either in person or by Zoom or some other method. You have to notify them of the means for doing that. You have to identify and include an opportunity for people to either attend or call in. Maybe it's done by internet, but there's several other methods similar to Zoom that you can use as well. So let's go to the next slide. So what they've added in AB 361, and this is a result of people meeting through Zoom and other means, similar means, is that there's been disruption. So they've added language that says that if there is a disruption that prevents broadcasting the meeting and so that the public cannot observe the meeting, and it's outside of the agency's control, and it prevents public comment, and people cannot call in to make public comment, then you have to stop the meeting and take no further action on agenda items until public access is restored. So hopefully this doesn't happen, or if it does happen, the disruption is very short so that you can continue with your business and get your business done.
I have a quick theoretical for you. Let's say that I'm in Acton and it's not known for internet coverage. And I've seen some agencies, not the one I work for, but I've seen some agencies say, if you're going to make a public comment on an agenda item, that you need to have that comment card put in ahead of the item being introduced. In my world, I may be sitting in the audience and somebody may say something, I may see the direction of what appears to be consensus developing being far outside of something I would agree with, or maybe I feel someone is missing information. So the agency I work for would allow anyone without disrupting the meeting, to approach the clerk to fill out a comment card and have that comment be heard, whether the discussion has started or not. I'm very much against throttling down the public like that. Also, I could say that my internet was interrupted while there was a discussion on, say, a hearing item that hadn't been voted on yet. I got a hold of someone and said, I would like to offer a comment. It's my understanding that the board could choose to reopen that item to hear that public comment, consider it, assuming, of course, that there wasn't action taken. But we need to make sure that everybody has the opportunity to speak, even if it's inconvenient to us. Would that be accurate?
Yeah, let me back up a little bit, give everybody a little background as to what's changed. As a result of these executive orders, this issue wasn't directly addressed, and so some districts were requiring people to submit their cards in advance, and of the meeting. If they didn't submit it in advance, they weren't able to make a public comment. And so there was a lot of complaints to the legislature about this. And so the legislature in AB 361 basically addressed this issue directly and said that you can no longer do that. You have to allow public comment in real time. And there's a slide, I think a couple of slides ahead, that talks about this. It basically says that if you have a time allotted for public comment and somebody, you have to hold that time open. So if somebody comes in the middle of that time frame and wants to make a public comment, you have to allow them to make a public comment. So, for example, if you have a total of 20 minutes for comments on agenda items, and then you have a couple of people make comments, and so you're maybe 6 or 7 minutes into the 20-minute period, and somebody comes forward with a card and says, I would also like to address this topic. You have to allow them to address this topic if they provide you that card within that 20-minute time frame. And so there's a slide that specifically addresses that, so I'll mention it again. But what you're addressing is an issue that came up the last year or so during this executive orders from the governor, which didn't address the issue, and so now the legislature stepped in and addressed the issue. So let's see. So we mentioned about service disruptions, or any action that you take during a disruption is subject to challenge under the provision of the Brown Act. So they want to make sure that if there is a disruption, that you wait until you get it taken care of and then you do your business. Hopefully there aren't too many disruptions and it doesn't cause board meetings to go late and so on. So let's go to the next slide. Okay, this is the slide that I was referring to. It requires districts to abolish the requirement that public comments must be submitted in advance of the meeting, and it has to provide an opportunity for the public to address and offer comment in real time. So you can still, give people the option of sending in written comments and reading them. Some districts were doing that, and some people complained about that. They didn't like it.
I think I'm losing internet connection.
Allow them
here we go.
to give their public comment, then that's okay. That's to make an exception to the general requirement that you can't require people to register their name. And as I mentioned, you can't close the comment period if somebody comes forward and wants to make a comment. So if you have a 20-minute time frame and somebody comes in during that time period and wants to make a comment, then you have to allow them to make a comment. So that was intended to address those issues that you raised just a minute ago and have been raised in a number of cities and in a number of school districts. So next slide. If the board doesn't have a time-limited comment period, some districts don't, then you just have to allow a reasonable time for the public to register and comment on each agenda item.
Did you find your food?
That could get complicated if what's reasonable. A lot of districts have a 20-minute time period, so probably 20 minutes would be reasonable. We can certainly help you with that if you have any specific issue come up. But the idea is, as you said, is to give people the opportunity to speak and address the board, and not to cause. We would recommend going on the side of caution and allowing people to speak. If they come in before you're completely past public comments and you're on, way down the agenda an hour later, I don't think you have to stop and let them speak. But if it's just 5 or 10 minutes, then I think it'd probably be a good idea to let them speak. So why don't we go to the next slide? So as we're talking about this issue, it basically it eliminates any early cutoff requirements. It cuts off any requirement that they be in writing. As I said, it allows people to speak in real time. to the board. And then the other thing that's key here that about AB 361 is every 30 days, the board will have to pass a resolution if they want to use the AB 361 exemption to have Zoom meetings and the flexibility to allow the public to participate by Zoom and not have the public in the boardroom. So we'll see how that goes. Some districts have decided that it's too cumbersome and they don't want to do that. Other districts have decided that there's too high a level of COVID infection in their community and they don't feel it's safe to have meetings in public and so in person, so they're continuing with the Zoom meeting. Let's go to the next slide. So in that resolution, you have to make findings no later than 30 days after the first teleconference meeting, and then every 30 days after that the board has reconsidered the state of emergency and that those circumstances continue. So right now, I think we're in this situation where we can say that the state of emergency is continuing. The state of emergency declared by the governor is still in effect. The California Department of Public Health has issued social distancing and masking directives, requirements, and those are still in effect. And so if that changes, then this situation may change as well. But right now, districts may continue to adopt the resolution every 30 days and declare a state of emergency. So let's go to the next slide. One thing I think that the legislature didn't consider is that sometimes board meetings are more than 30 days apart. If you only meet once a month, given the nature of the calendar, you could have a board meeting that's 31 or 32 days apart. And so we'll have to just make sure that you renew that resolution every 30 days. I guess we will have to do it either through doing it in advance or calling a special meeting just for the purpose of the resolution. We'll just have to see how that works out. The provisions of AB 361, they're automatically repealed January 1st, 2024. So I think the hope is that this pandemic will be over by then. I think everybody feels the same way, that they're hoping that it'll be over before that it doesn't even last that long. But we'll just have to see. There's no way of knowing if it'll be over by then. And of course, the legislature can make further changes to the Brown Act between now and then. So we'll just have to keep continually updating school districts with any new amendments to the Brown Act. So let's go to the next slide. I think we mentioned this before. Any kind of register or attendance for board meetings, it's voluntary. You cannot require people to sign a document or register their name and address. That provision remains in effect and is not waived. So let's go to the next slide. And then the provision that allows any member of the public to record a proceeding, either audio or video, if you have people in attendance in person, still remains, unless it's obstructive or it's creating a problem, then they're allowed to do that. So if we can go to the next slide. So if the board tapes or film records the meeting, and which is becoming more and more common now with Zoom meetings, those recordings are public records and have to be kept for 30 days. After 30 days, they can be destroyed. So people have the right to see those recordings during that 30-day period. Okay, so the next slide is Lexi. So I'm going to turn it over to Lexi.
Thank you so much. So as we all know, we do need to provide a time and place for holding our regular meetings. And both our regular and special meetings need to be held within the boundaries of the territory over which we exercise jurisdiction, except in limited cases. Those cases may be to comply with a state or federal law or court order, or to attend a judicial or administrative proceeding to which the local agency is a party. It may be that we are inspecting real or personal property that cannot be conveniently brought within the boundaries of the territory over which we exercise jurisdiction, provided that the topic of the meeting that we're holding is limited to items directly related to that particular real or personal property. We can also participate in meetings or discussions of multi-agency significance that are outside of the boundaries of our jurisdiction, but any meeting or discussion that's held pursuant to this particular subdivision of the government code must take place within the jurisdiction of one of these participating local agencies and must be noticed by all participating agencies, as is provided for in the Brown Act for our regular and special meetings. We can also meet in the closest meeting facility if our agency has no meeting facility within the boundaries of the territory over which we exercise jurisdiction, or at the principal office of the local agency if that office is located outside of the territory over which we exercise jurisdiction. We can meet outside of our immediate jurisdiction when meeting with elected or appointed officials of the United States or the state of California when a local meeting is impractical, and that meeting is solely for the purpose to discuss a legislative or regulatory issue affecting our agency and over which that federal or state official has jurisdiction. We can also meet outside of our immediate jurisdiction if that meeting takes place in or nearby a facility that is owned by our agency, again, provided that the topic of the meeting is limited to items directly related to that facility. Or you can meet outside of your jurisdiction for a meeting at the office of your agency's legal counsel for a closed session on items of pending litigation when doing so would reduce legal costs or fees. So, in addition, we can meet outside of the territory of our school district to do any of the following: to attend a conference on non-adversarial collective bargaining techniques, or to interview members of the public residing in another district with reference to the potential of employment of an applicant for the position of superintendent of the district, or to interview an employee or potential employee from another school district. So members of the public and media may request that the agenda of each meeting and all documents constituting the agenda packet be mailed to them. And if so requested, the agenda and documents in that agenda packet shall be made available in appropriate alternative formats to persons with a disability as is required by the ADA and its regulations.
Lexi?
Yes.
Very quick question.
Absolutely.
Theoretical. I'm not psychic. I don't want this to happen. Let's say that 3 of the board members or majority of the board members attend the California School Boards Association conference for training. That happens all the time. Let's say that there's some type of emergency, like a water main break that is washing away the hillside, and the money to get a contractor rolling on it would exceed the superintendent's discretionary spending limit. Where would you have the meeting legally to take the vote for an emergency if you're in San Diego?
Oh, that's a really good question. Ron, I think that might actually fall under teleconferencing requirements.
Yeah. What you could do is you would call a special meeting, give 24-hour notice, reserve a conference room at the hotel, make it accessible to the public, post an agenda at the hotel, and then have your meeting. So you could do it fairly, with even under the pre-COVID requirements, using the special meeting requirement. So, I think given those circumstances, you could do it by teleconference.
Thank you.
Absolutely. So as we all know, our agendas have to be posted at least 72 hours prior to our regular meeting. And the agenda has to contain a brief general description of each item of business that is to be transacted or discussed at the meeting. The brief description is typically approximately 20 words, It could be a little bit more, it could be a little bit less. And as we know, that meeting shall be posted, the agenda shall be posted in a location freely accessible to the public and on our district's website. And again, the description must be sufficient enough to give the public notice of the items that are to be discussed or acted upon. So in this particular court case, the Court of Appeal held that an agenda item that simply stated public employee employment contract was insufficient, because in this particular case, the board was looking to dismiss the public employee, and that was the point of discussion at the meeting. So as we know, there is actually specific closed session safe harbor language, public employee discipline, dismissal, release, that would have been more appropriate in this particular circumstance. And again, as I mentioned, an agenda item generally need not exceed 20 words. I apologize, my mouse has just, I don't know what it's doing. I'm so sorry. The agenda must be, again, freely accessible to the public and posted on the agency's website. It must specify the time and location of the regular meeting and, again, posted to an area accessible to the public. Very commonly we see it at our district offices. Members of the public do have the right to place matters directly related to district business on the agenda, and also have the right to address the board regarding items on the agenda as the items are taken up. And again, if requested, the agenda needs to be made available in an ADA compliant format. Again, as we know, no action or discussion shall be undertaken on any item not appearing in the posted agenda, except that as members of the governing board or your staff can briefly respond to statements made or questions posed by persons expressing their public testimony during public comments. This is a very common board bylaw language. Also very common board bylaw language is the board may ask staff members to report back to the board on a matter and place the matter on an agenda at a future board meeting. And any complaint or request of information should be forwarded to the superintendent in accordance with the board bylaws. And again, these are common, this is common language to board bylaws. We'd look at your board bylaws more specifically to say what they state. So effective January 1st, 2019, this government code section was amended to again indicate that the district, if it has an internet website, has to post the agenda on the primary internet website homepage that is accessible through a prominent direct link to the current agenda. That direct link to the agenda cannot be in a contextual menu, but a link in addition to the direct link to the agenda may be accessible through a contextual menu. This online posting needs to, including an agenda posted in an integrated agenda menu and platform, needs to be posted in an open format that is retrievable, downloadable, indexable, and electronically searchable by commonly used internet search applications. It needs to be a platform-independent and machine-readable agenda and available to the public free of charge without any restrictions that would impede the reuse or redistribution of our agenda. We talked about how they need to be posted 72 hours in advance. However, there is no requirement that materials given to the board must be available to the public or posted 72 hours in advance. Rather, the Brown Act states that other writings, when they are distributed to board members in connection with a matter that will be discussed at an open board meeting, shall be made available to the public upon request without delay, and at the time the distribution is made, shall be made available for public inspection at the district office or the office where the board meets. Now, we already know that we post our items to our agenda on our agenda board docs board docs website anyway. So you're already complying with this. You're giving the public the information that they would need to understand what the board is going to be looking at and or acting upon. And again, these need to be made in an ADA compliant format if requested. No action shall be taken on any item that is not appearing on the posted agenda unless 2/3 of the members of the governing board determined that the need to take the action, my apologies, arose after posting the agenda. This, however, is a very rare circumstance. There needs to be a truly urgent need to amend an agenda. And in this particular case, the Court of Appeal of California said the public opposition at a public meeting does not authorize the amendment of an agenda. So that alone does not get you there. Again, it needs to be a matter, an urgent matter that truly arose after the preparation of the agenda for the regular board meeting. Very commonly, what we recommend is that a special meeting be duly noticed and held, either before the board meeting begins or on another date, to address that particular item if we can give 72 hours notice. So every agenda at a regular meeting provides the opportunity for members of the public to directly address the governing board on any item of interest to the public that is, again, within the agency's jurisdiction. And this opportunity shall be provided either before or during the board's consideration of the item, regardless of whether it's an open or closed session. But our legislative body can and has adopted reasonable regulations limiting the total amount of time allocated for public testimony on a particular issue or for individual speakers. So again, another common board bylaw, that regular board meetings be adjourned at a specific time. 10 p.m. is common. In your board bylaw, it's 10:30 p.m. unless that time is extended as determined by the majority of the board. And you do have language regarding limitation of the total time for public input on each item to 20 minutes. So the government code states that when a legislative body of a local agency limits that time for public comment, we are required to provide at least twice the allotted time to a member of the public who utilizes a translator to ensure that non-native English speakers receive the same opportunity to directly address the legislative body. However, this would not apply if we are utilizing simultaneous translation equipment in a manner that allows the local agency to hear the translated public testimony simultaneously. So if the comment is being translated at the same time, we don't need to provide additional time. But if we are utilizing a translator, such as a district individual or employee who is working to help translate public comment for an individual who is not a native English speaker, we would give that person twice the amount of time that we would provide to somebody who is a native English speaker and does not require translation services. As you know, we cannot prohibit public criticism of the policies, procedures, programs, or services of our agency or the acts or omissions of the legislative body. So we are required to allow for negative public comment, regardless of whether it's about us, about our staff members, potentially about another parent, or other items that are of interest to the legislative body. So, yes.
Before we move on to the special meeting section, I would like to point out to everybody who worked with us for the past several years and now into your second administration, I think it's our agendas are characterized by being released timely, that the descriptions of the items to be discussed are basically a mini staff memo, and that anything that minutes, warrant register, any general staff recommendations that would justify what the superintendent's reasoning is for presenting the recommendation. I think you'll find our agendas are exemplary.
Okay, I love it. Yeah, so far, I think what's interesting about agendas is that we always find ways to improve them, even our own language written into agendas. There are certain items that do not have particular descriptions under the Brown Act or Education Code, such as student matters or student discipline matters. So you won't necessarily find one specific way of writing that information into the board agenda. But certainly, yes, I have been impressed with the way that your agendas are organized. But I do, as I mentioned, we always find something, and we always find something in our own work too. So it's not something that's exclusive to a school district. We like to tweak our agenda items and how we describe things as well. So moving forward with special meetings, as you know, because we're in one right now, they can be called at any time by the presiding officer or majority of the members of the board. And 24 hours notice must be given of special meetings, and the legislative body again needs to post the agenda on the internet website. And only business on the special meeting notice may be considered at special meetings. So they are limited to the particular agenda items and business within that agenda. We cannot call a special meeting, as we mentioned earlier, regarding the salaries, salary schedules, or compensation paid in the form of fringe benefits of a local agency executive. And a local agency can call a special meeting to discuss the local agency's budget. So again, compensation, salary, or salary schedule paid in the form of fringe benefits for a local agency executive. We have a slide later that describes who that is, but we're looking at district superintendents, cabinet members, department heads, may only be discussed and acted upon at a regularly scheduled board meeting. And in this particular case, again, the Court of Appeal held that in this government code section, it does control and that we cannot amend the agenda at a special board meeting, but because no action was taken in closed session, in this particular case, there was no lawsuit that could move forward because there was not any action taken in this particular case. So there wasn't, despite the fact that the agenda should not have been amended, there was not a resulting issue that popped out from that. Very quickly, we're all post-pandemic, incredibly familiar with this. Emergency meetings can be called by the president or the majority of the board, and we have to provide at least 1 hour notice to the media, except when we're in a dire emergency, where the notice may be made at or near the time the presiding officer notifies the board members. So when we talk about an emergency, we're talking about things like work stoppage, a crippling activity, or other activity that severely impairs the health or safety, as determined by the majority of the board. And a dire emergency would be a crippling disaster, mass destruction, a terrorist act, or a threatened terrorist act. And the board in an emergency meeting may meet in closed session upon a 2/3 vote of the board, or again, unanimous vote if less than 2/3 of the board members are present. So I'm going to go ahead and send it back over to Ron.
Thank you, Lexi. So this next set of slides has to do with authorized closed sessions, when you can go into closed session, and then there'll be some safe harbor closed session language. So first thing to consider is prior to holding any closed session, the board has to disclose in open meeting the items that are going to be discussed in closed session. So those are usually posted on the agenda, and then before going to closed session, the board president just reiterates what's going to be discussed and what's on the agenda. So if we go to the next slide. You cannot discuss other business in closed session, only the business that's on the closed session agenda, and it has to be within the scope of what is a permissible closed session. One of those is you're authorized to receive advice from the district's legal counsel regarding pending litigation or to initiate litigation. So keep in mind, it used to be a number of years ago that you could meet with your attorney to get general legal advice. That's no longer the case. It's only advice regarding pending litigation or to initiate litigation. So, for example, this workshop is being held in open session. We could not hold it in closed session because it doesn't involve pending litigation or initiating litigation. So if we go to the next slide. Another area where you can have a closed session is commonly known as the personnel exception. That includes appointment, employment, evaluation of performance, discipline or dismissal of a public employee, or to hear complaints or charges brought against a public employee. Now, the definition of public employee does not include public officers or elected officials. It only refers to employees. So we go to the next slide. So evaluation of performance can include the consideration of the criteria that you're going to be using to evaluate the superintendent or an assistant superintendent or other matters related So there's some leeway there with respect to evaluations. Feedback, dialogue regarding the performance of the superintendent, for example, is a traditional part of the evaluation process and comes within the evaluation of performance. So we go to the next slide.
I have a question for you.
Yes, sure.
On the one where it says authorized closed sessions, prior to holding any closed session, we need to identify, I guess, in general terms, what we're going to discuss back there. How does that take place?
Typically, board president will open the meeting, and then they'll indicate that you're going to go into closed session, and indicate that in closed session we're going to be. Usually, the board president just reads what's on the agenda, on the closed session agenda. We're going to be meeting with legal counsel to discuss pending litigation, case numbers, and just list, refer to the case numbers on the agenda. We're going to be in closed session to discuss the appointment of public employees and to discuss the evaluation and performance of the superintendent. Kind of typically that. It's not a lengthy description of the closed session. It's basically an oral repetition of what's already on the agenda.
Provided that you're using the closed session safe harbor language in the Brown Act, which we'll go over some examples in a few slides, you are going to be safe with what you're reporting out, reporting out as to what's being handled in closed session. So like Ron said, it's very common for the board president to just read what is listed on the agenda as the closed session items. And those closed session items will contain the information that's necessary pursuant to the Brown Act to take those matters into consideration in closed session.
Keeping in mind the confidentiality of the details of the discussion, correct?
Right. So for example, when you're dealing with a public, if you're dealing with a disciplinable matter or a potentially disciplinable matter with regard to a public employee, all you need to list is public employee discipline, dismissal, release. That's it. There's nothing else in there. Or if you're dealing, for example, with a student matter, we may reference the student matter by an internally created case number and not utilizing the student's name.
Thank you.
Okay.
I've got a great example. Tell me about this one. We're going to be discussing a potential lawsuit brought by the father of a nonverbal child for an IEP violation that requires the use of a district-supplied AAC device. Good?
Yeah, that would sound like it's pending litigation or anticipated litigation.
You may not even need to get that specific, quite
But
frankly.
I would hope not. Thank you.
Ron, I mean, I think we could put that under pending or anticipated litigation,
Right.
and there's specific things that we're required to state, but it would also depend on the type of pending litigation or existing litigation and where that falls under the Brown Act. But you might not even need to get that descriptive.
Okay, so is this notification, is this a verbal notification when we get ready to go to closed session? Or does this have to be something that's materially privileged?
So it would be on your agenda, which is publicly available. And then, as Ron mentioned, your board president would just read what is on the agenda listed under closed session. So it would be a verbal or an oral report of what's already written into your agenda.
Yeah, typically they don't usually read it verbatim. If there's 4 litigation matters that are going to be discussed, the board president might say, there are 4 litigation matters that are being discussed that are listed on our agenda. We're going to be meeting with legal counsel to discuss those. We've got 5 positions that we're going to be discussed. Appointments are listed on the agenda as well. And we've got several student matters that are listed on the agenda that we're going to be discussing in closed session. And that's kind of typically how the oral description goes. And that's sufficient. It doesn't have to be a verbatim reading. So long as you've got it on the agenda and it's orally referenced so that somebody who's sitting there in the audience will know what you're going to be talking about in closed session. In general, not the specifics.
So our superintendent is making a report in closed session, so we put down a superintendent report. We'll be discussing the report by the superintendent on A, B, C, D, E. This, that, and then just leave it at that.
Well, you can't discuss student matters in closed session under the education code. So if it hasn't reached the level of litigation, you may list it as a student matter. It depends on what stage of it's at as far as litigation. If it's maybe an administrative hearing or a complaint has been filed.
So if the superintendent's giving you an update about a personnel matter, for example, or a litigation, for example, or there's a update on labor negotiations, those all have very specific exemptions to the open meeting requirement that allow them to come in a closed session. There's not an exemption for a superintendent report, for example. So the discussions that you have in closed session have to fall within one of those exemptions, or as Ron mentioned, there's some specific language in the ed code that allows us to take certain types of student matters into closed session for discussion. But we need to make sure that we have that listed very specifically under that what we call safe harbor language in the closed session agenda, or otherwise the item cannot be discussed in closed session.
Sorry guys, but the example I gave is utterly ridiculous, because you'll notice maybe in some experience you have or have not had somewhere in a place it exists or does not, that you will find board members that are very adversarial about talking about anything that involves a student prior to bringing forward a recommendation for a settlement from an attorney, because it tends to bias the board, and you may have corrupted your ability or something like that. So, yeah, the example I gave is the most egregious, ridiculous thing. And sometimes the public may want something like that, but you've just violated every civil right that anyone ever has when you do that.
Well, usually it comes to the board in the context of a complaint or litigation, and then you have an attorney in closed session with you to discuss it. Superintendent, of course, could also give a report, and sometimes it's just an update or just to tell the board what's coming in the future, just so that you have a heads up on what the nature of the complaint is, so that you can think about it and give it some thought, and then maybe at a future board meeting you discuss settlement. It just depends on the facts and circumstances of each individual case. Okay, well, I hope we answered your question. So if we go to the next slide, courts have held that you can't discuss the salary level. You can talk about the evaluation of performance, but when you get to salary, then that has to be discussed in open session. So when you get to the specific dollar amount, that's when you go into open session. Other closed session matters, you can meet with a representative to provide direction when you're negotiating with an unrepresented employee. So sometimes, usually in a larger district, you have a representative representing supervisory or management employees. Not usually in a smaller district. But when you get to the final action on compensation, that's discussed in open session. Okay, for the next slide. When you're considering charges brought against a public employee, then that can be done in closed session unless the employee requests a public hearing. And in my experience, it's been pretty rare for an employee to ask for a public hearing, because usually they don't want that type of information to be out in the public. And then as a condition of holding that closed session, you have to give written notice to the employee of the complaint or charges 24 hours in advance. And if that notice isn't given, then any action against the employee on those specific complaints or charges can be held null or void. So you have to be careful to make sure that you give that notice to the employees so that they can have an opportunity to present their side of the story and possibly rebut those charges. If we go to the next slide, this has to do with salary negotiations, salary schedules, compensation in the form of fringe benefits when you're talking about bargaining unit employees. So typically a school district has a representative, might be the superintendent or assistant superintendent, who represents the board in negotiations with the certificated and classified units. So that discussion can be held in closed session to give your representative direction. So if we go to the next slide. So typically what you would do is you would review your position with your negotiator, what you are willing to offer to the employees, and then a negotiator would then meet with the union and report back to the board. So some of that direction can be by consensus. Sometimes it's in this form of approval of a tentative agreement, but the formal approval would take place in open session. If we go to the next slide. Okay. We mentioned about meeting with the local agency's designated representative, but you, when you get to funding priorities, budget cuts or layoffs, that's got to be done in open session. So, to give you an example of something that happened a number of years back, when I first started in working with school districts, we had a school district that was a meeting in closed session on negotiations, and the issue came up that the employees were asking for, I believe it was a 5% salary increase. The district had offered 2 or 3%, and the question came up during the closed session is, well, how much would it cost if we, increased, if we agreed to their demand of 5%, what would it cost? And so discussion ensued about how much that would cost, and then they discussed, let's say that cost was $500,000. So then they proceeded to discuss, well, where would we cut $500,000 from the budget? It was decided in that same closed session that they would close their continuation high school, or their alternative high school, I should say. And that would save $500,000. And then they could, reach agreement with the certificated employees. So they agreed to do that. They came out of closed session. There was nobody in the open session. This was late at night. They voted to approve the 5% increase and to close the alternative school. Well, a couple days later, newspaper read the minutes of the board meeting, read an article that the alternative school was going to be closed. Parents got upset, started picketing the district office, complaining that they didn't have notice that that this was going to be discussed. They then filed a lawsuit. It ended up in court, and the court ruled against the school district. After this case, the legislature put specific language in the Brown Act that said, general discussions about budget priorities, budget cuts, etc., has to be in open session. So you can talk about what direction you want to give your negotiator, but once you start talking about, get beyond how much a particular salary increase is going to cost, and you're starting to talk about, well, where are we going to get the money to do that, that has to be done in open session. When you're talking about budget cuts, budget priorities, all of that has to be done in open session. So we can go to the next slide. So the board can meet in closed session to get advice from its legal counsel regarding its position in litigation. And you have to indicate the form of that litigation. Is it pending litigation? Is it anticipated litigation? And what is it? A proceeding in court, administrative body, hearing officer, etc. So you need to be specific, and we'll talk about some of that safe harbor language. Then if we go to the next slide, anticipated litigation, there has to be significant exposure to litigation based on existing facts or circumstances. And this is, legal counsel has to advise you on the specific circumstances, but there has to be facts and circumstances that might result in litigation. There has to be facts and circumstances which are known to the plaintiff that could lead to a claim, like you're aware of an accident, you're aware of something that occurred, and there's a possibility that there's going to be a litigation. Maybe there was a slip and fall, maybe there was some type of incident that occurred where somebody was injured. So that might be a potential litigation. That somebody made a threat in a public meeting to sue the school district, or if it was made outside of a meeting, it was a contemporaneous record was made. So, for example, there's been a few occasions where an attorney has made a threat over the phone to me that if we don't get this resolved, we're going to sue the school district. Well, what I immediately do is then send an email to the superintendent letting him know that this threat was made, so that if we want to meet in closed session with the board to discuss this potential litigation, we can do so. So I make a contemporaneous record of the threat. So we go to the next slide. So we've kind of mentioned a couple of times as we've been going through this, in the Brown Act itself, there are recommendations for specific agenda language, which has become known as safe harbor language, because if you use this language, then it's presumed by the courts that you've met the agenda requirements. So if we go to the next slide, this first one is conference with real property negotiators. We didn't talk a lot about this, but that's another grounds for going into a closed session. If there's a specific property that you're interested in, either purchasing or selling, you can go into closed session. You have to list the property, the street address, who your negotiator is, and whether you're going to, who the negotiating parties are, and price in terms of payment. If those are under consideration, then that has to be listed as well. So if we can go to the next slide. Here's the proposed language in the Brown Act for litigation. So it says in capital letters, conference with legal counsel, existing litigation. And then we list the government code section. And then we list the name of the case. So it could be Smith versus Jones. And then there's a case number. We list the case number. Unless that would jeopardize service of process. That doesn't usually happen with school district litigation. So typically we list the litigation. So frequently if you look at the agendas of other agencies, if you look at the County Board of Supervisors, city councils, other school districts, you'll see this language being used. It's almost universally used throughout the state, so that districts are assured of not getting sued for not properly listing closed session items on the agenda. So we go to the next slide. We have a similar one, conference with legal counsel, anticipated litigation. And then we indicate the code section. We indicate information that was noted. We do that in general. We'll say a threat of litigation was made by a third party or a potential litigant against the school district. That type of thing. Or if it's initiation of litigation, we put the number of cases. That doesn't come up too often because school districts are not usually initiating litigation, but it could come up. And so then we would list the number of cases. If we go to the next slide. This is liability claims. When people are injured and they allege that it's due to negligence of the school district, they're required to file a claim first before they file a lawsuit, what's typically called a tort claim. And so the risk manager of the school district typically would get those claims and then discuss it with the board. So you can meet in closed session to see if you want to resolve the claim prior to litigation. So that's a grounds for going into closed session. So you have to specify the name of the claimant. If it's a minor, you can usually just indicate that it's a minor or a student, so that you don't indicate, disclose their identity. And then with public employment appointment, you just indicate the position to be filled. It could be assistant superintendent, principal of a school, whatever it might be. And then also the next slide, public employment is another one that's used. Public employment performance evaluation. You have to specify the position. And as Alexi mentioned earlier, public employee discipline, dismissal, release, no additional information is needed because, of course, of the possibility of embarrassment or a violation of somebody's privacy. So we don't put any additional information. Next slide. Conference with labor negotiators. We touched on this before. You just indicate who your the names of your designated representatives. That could be your assistant superintendent of HR, your assistant superintendent of business services, and then indicate, or it could be an outside person, or you can list the employee organizations that you're negotiating with. That could be your certificated organization, your classified organization, or unrepresented employees. And then next slide. This comes up frequently. Who is allowed to be in closed session? There's nothing in the Brown Act that limits who can be in closed session. But there should be a need to be there. They should have an official or anybody in closed session for a number of reasons. One, these are very confidential matters. You have just an anonymous or random person in there. They may not understand that they have to keep this confidential, and so you could have a breach of confidentiality. It just can be, disruptive to have somebody in there who doesn't have a real role to play. Okay, with that, I'm going to turn back over to Lexi to talk about the next set of slides.
Excellent. So along with the idea of having certain discussions in closed session, we do have to publicly report out any action that's taken in closed session, as well as the vote or the abstention of every member present. And those public reports can be made either orally or in writing. Very commonly, they are made orally after closed session. Documents that are approved or adopted by the governing board in closed session must be made available to the public on request. And districts may keep minutes or record closed sessions, but are not required to do so. Action taken to appoint, employ, dismiss, accept the resignation of, or otherwise affect the employment status of a public employee in closed session is reported at the public meeting during which the closed session is held. And while this says we identify the title of the position, very commonly what we end up doing is identifying the employee by employee number rather than utilizing the title of the position. And again, the minutes need to refer to the employee number and not the employee's name in particular. And if no action is taken, then no report is required. So the report of a dismissal or of a non-renewal of an employment contract is deferred until the first public meeting following the exhaustion of any administrative remedies. So for example, if you would be moving forward with the dismissal of a classified employee, the report of the dismissal of that employee would not be taken until after the employee, if they so chose, had a hearing with either the board or the hearing officer, a decision was rendered, and the board adopted the decision of the hearing officer or made a different decision depending on the collective bargaining agreement obligations. Approval of an agreement concluding labor negotiations with representative employees is reported after that agreement is final and it has been accepted and ratified by the other party to the negotiations. We've talked about this already. This just outlines again who is a local agency executive. With that last bullet point, while we see the term not classified employees, we don't mean individuals like your CBO if that's a classified position. We're talking about our classified employees generally. So the education code, as we've already discussed, does authorize the governing board to hold closed session to consider the suspension or other disciplinary action or expulsion of a student. But bear in mind, one caveat to that is that the education code does very specifically state that an act to expel a student must be taken in open session. So the vote on expulsion is an open session item. And the Attorney General has stated that members of the legislative body cannot publicly disclose information received and discussed in closed session concerning pending litigation. So again, the board can meet to consider student disciplinary action and other action in connection with a student of the district if considering the matter in public would violate state or federal laws regarding confidentiality of students' records. And I think Member Falsgraf had already spoken to that concept. So when we're talking about participation in public meetings, the Court of Appeal has held that failure of a certain legislative body to pay attention during an administrative hearing on a company's request in a zoning matter deprive the company of due process. So this next set of slides talks about the board member participation in that public meeting. So in this particular meeting, the company was seeking a modification of city ordinances relating to the regulation of an adult business. And after holding the public hearing, the city zoning administrator granted the modification that was sought by the company. As you can likely imagine, the neighborhood and community members who opposed those modifications then appealed the zoning administrative decision to the city of the Los Angeles City Council, who scheduled a public hearing. That public hearing was videotaped, and the tape shows that when the city council heard the matter, only 2 council members were visibly paying attention. Other members chose to engage in activities such as talking with aides, eating, reviewing paperwork, talking to one another, talking on their cell phones, and getting up and walking around the room. The video showed that the council members engaged in similar behavior when speakers in opposition to the zoning change spoke. So this case in particular points out that when governing boards are conducting a hearing on, for example, employee discipline matters, student discipline matters, or other similar issues, you are sitting in a quasi-judicial role, and it is the expectation of the legislature and the public that the decorum, demeanor, and method of conducting that hearing all contribute to the process of conducting a fair hearing and giving the parties due process under the law. So with willful disruption, just briefly, if a meeting is willfully interrupted so as to render the orderly conduct of the meeting not feasible, an order cannot be restored by the removal of individuals who are willfully interrupting the meeting. The board can order the meeting room cleared and continue in session. If doing so, we can only consider matters on the agenda, and representatives of the press need to be allowed to attend. Agendas of public meetings and other writings, when distributed to all or majority of all of the members of the legislative body of the board, by any person in connection with a matter subject to discussion or consideration at a board meeting, are disclosable public records under the CPRA and shall be made available upon request without delay. However, a writing that is exempt from public disclosure under the CPRA shall not be included, and writings that are public records and are distributed during a public meeting shall be made available for public inspection at the meeting if those materials were prepared by the local agency or a member of the legislative body, or they need to be made available after the meeting if they were prepared by another person. And again, we are required to comply with the ADA. If a writing that is a public record that is related to an agenda item for an open session meeting is distributed less than 72 hours prior to the meeting, that writing must be made available for public inspection at the time the writing is also distributed to the majority of the board members. It must be made available for public inspection at a public office or location, and the address of the location shall be listed on agendas of the meetings of the district and posted on the district's website in a manner that makes clear that the writing relates to an agenda item for an upcoming meeting. And again, with distributions of documents, when members of a legislative body are authorized to access the writing of the body or of the agency in the administration of their duties, the local agency may not discriminate between or among any of the members of the legislative body as to which the writing or portions thereof is made available or when it is made available. So I'm going to turn it back over to Ron for statutory penalties in violation of the Brown Act.
Thank you, Lexi. As you're probably aware, there are criminal and civil penalties for violations of the Brown Act. So these next set of slides are going to be talking about those. So if you're, this first bullet point talks about each member attending a meeting of the governing board where the public is intentionally deprived of information to which the member knows or has reason to know the public is entitled to, is in violation of the Brown Act and may be charged with a criminal offense. This type of thing is very, very rare. It's very rare that anything like this is intentionally done. Occasionally, it's inadvertently done, but it's very rare for this to be an intentional situation. In addition, the district attorney or any interested person may bring a civil action. So the district attorney not only can bring a criminal offense, but also has the authority to bring civil actions against a school board or members of the board, as well as any interested person. So in my experience, we've had both. We've had district attorney usually will send a letter rather than file an action right away. Making an inquiry or doing an investigation. And then usually the matter gets resolved before it gets to a civil situation. Also, members of the community many times will send letters alleging a violation of the Brown Act. So these next few slides, we'll get into that a little bit more. So if we go to the next slide, okay, there it is. Okay, so prior to any action being commenced under the Brown Act, the district attorney or any interested person has to make a demand on the board to cure or correct the action alleged. And so we've dealt with a lot of these over the years. People send in demands. And so what we do is we come in as legal counsel, we review what occurred with the board and with the district. And if we think there was a violation, then we'll work to cure it. If we don't think there was a violation, we'll send back a letter to the person indicating we didn't think there was a violation and explaining why we didn't think there was a violation. So if we could go to the next slide. Okay, so the way there's a certain time frame for this, the written demand has to be made within 90 days from the date of the action taken. So this is important because you don't want somebody a year later to come in and say, hey, we think you violated the Brown Act at your meeting, in November 2020, 11 months ago. It's hard to remember what happened at the board meeting, and it just keeps things going. If somebody thinks there's a problem, they need to make a demand within 90 days. And if it's a violation, unless the action was taken in open session, if they claim it's a violation of open session, then they have to make the demand within 30 days. And then if we go to the next slide, if you get one of these demands within 30 days, the district has to either cure or correct the challenged action and inform the demanding party of its actions to cure or correct, and inform the demanding party in writing what their decision is. So there's kind of a formal administrative process to resolve these things. And then there's also the ability of courts, if it does go to court, to award costs and reasonable fees to the plaintiff if it's found that there was a violation. So that can get costly, those attorneys' fees. And so there's a lot of incentive to make sure that you comply with the Brown Act. Go to the next slide. So if there's a past violation involved, the district attorney or any interested person, and when that's a very broad term, any interested person, they don't even have to necessarily live in your school district. They just have to be what is an interested person. They can submit a cease and desist letter by mail or fax. It has to be submitted to the board within 9 months of the alleged violation and state the time during which the board may respond to the cease and desist letter. So this has to do with past violations, but what are continuing violations? So they have a little more time if it, had within this is a 9-month period, but it has to do with going forward. And then the board has to respond within 30 days after receiving the cease and desist letter. So if you go to the next slide. So in these types of situations, the board has 60 days to respond to the cease and desist letter. And if there's no unconditional commitment to cease all further violations, then the district attorney or an interested party can commence an action in court. So they have to show that there was a past violation, and if there isn't a commitment to not violate the Brown Act again, then they can go to court. And then the court has to decide whether there was past violations and whether there's continuing violations. And then there's an actual form, if you go to the next slide, that is supposed to be used. It's in the Brown Act itself. You have to indicate the XYZ school district has received your cease and desist letter, and then the date alleging the following described actions, and then you have to go through. So this is the format that you have to use for alleged past violations in response to a cease and desist letter. So we can go to the next slide. Okay, so the unconditional commitment has to be approved by the board in open session at a regular special meeting as a separate item of business, so it can't be on the consent agenda. The board has to provide the unconditional commitment to cease and desist from further violations, and then an action in court can't be commenced. So if you agree to an unconditional commitment to cease and desist, then that ends the litigation. So the idea behind this was to not have any unnecessary litigation, but to have compliance, to emphasize compliance with the Brown Act rather than costly litigation. And then if a lawsuit has been filed alleging a past violation, and the court determines that the board has provided a unconditional commitment to cease and desist, then the lawsuit has to be dismissed. So this is helping with unnecessary litigation. If we go to the next slide. So one of the specific commitments in the Brown Act, or specific language in the Brown Act, indicates that an unconditional commitment to cease and desist from further violations cannot be construed as admissible in evidence that a past violation occurred. Because you get in a situation where you say, well, if we agree to cease and desist and not do this in the future, are we going to get sued for past violations? Are we, in effect, admitting that we violated the Brown Act in the past? So the legislature wanted to avoid that situation. Like you said, they want compliance. They don't want lawsuits. And so they said, no, you cannot use evidence of a unconditional commitment as evidence of a past violation. So that's helpful in that respect. So if you inadvertently violated the Brown Act and discovered that you did, this gives you the opportunity to correct it, to respond to a cease and desist letter by saying, we will unconditionally commit to not violating the Brown Act in this manner any longer, and then there cannot be a lawsuit. So it corrects the situation and it avoids litigation. However, though, if after you're making that unconditional commitment, time goes by and then you engage in that violation again, then there could be litigation. So it helps, but it's not a complete waiver of litigation. We go to the next slide. Now there is the ability of the board to rescind an unconditional commitment by majority vote in open session as a separate item of business, but it's very rare that this happens. Usually these things get resolved informally. We don't too often go through this formal process, But if we do, and we make an unconditional commitment, it's very unlikely that you're going to rescind it, because then you're going to be subject to scrutiny and the possibility of a lawsuit. So if we can go to the next slide. If you're going to rescind it, they want it to be very public, the legislature, and so they require that the agenda language say rescission of Brown Act commitment, and then you have to give 30 days notice to consider the rescission and give notice to the district attorney and each interested person. So if somebody sent you a cease and desist letter, you make this unconditional commitment not to violate the Brown Act, and then a year later you want to rescind it, you have to go through this very formal process of letting those specific people know. So not likely that this is going to happen, and the legislature intentionally tried to discourage boards from doing this. So if we can go to the next slide. So if you do go through this rescission, and I'm not aware that anybody's actually done this, but the district attorney or an interested person can then file a lawsuit for violation of the Brown Act. And then you could have an award of costs and attorney's fees as a result of that lawsuit. So it's a very risky thing to do, very risky. We go to the next slide. So then if the governing board has provided an unconditional commitment after the 30-day period that was required, the court can still award costs and attorney's fees. So it's important that you provide that unconditional commitment in a timely manner. So that's something to be very cognizant of and consider. So we go to the next slide. If there is a violation of the Brown Act, the court can award costs, they can award attorney's fees. And if the governing board has provided unconditional commitment, like I said, after the 30-day period, then they can award attorney's fees and costs. If we go to the next slide, those attorney's fees and costs are typically paid by the local agency. It's not a personal liability of a board member. Okay, that's kind of a lot. If anybody had any questions or comments on that portion of it, we'd be happy to answer any questions. Okay, well, the next section is Lexi, so I'll turn over to Lexi.
So we'll just wrap up with the concept of disclosure of confidential information, which means any communication made in a closed session that is specifically related to the basis for the legislative body to meet lawfully in closed session under the Brown Act. So conversations you're having in closed session regarding your closed session items. Violation of this confidentiality requirement may be remedied by injunctive action against either an employee who has willfully disclosed the confidential information, or it can result in the referral of a member of our governing board, our legislative body, who has willfully disclosed confidential information to the grand jury. So disciplinary action against an employee for such a violation would require that the employee has either received training as to the requirements of the Brown Act or has otherwise been given notice of these requirements, and it shall not be a violation for an individual to make a confidential inquiry or complaint to a district attorney or grand jury concerning a perceived violation of the law. Just again, to wrap it up, when we talk about disorderly conduct during open meetings, if a meeting is willfully interrupted by a group or groups of persons, that it renders the orderly conduct of a meeting not feasible, and order cannot be restored by removing individuals who are willfully interrupting the meeting. The members of the legislative body conducting the meeting may order the meeting room cleared and can continue in session. Again, with only acting on those items or considering those items on our agenda and allowing the news media to remain present. So at this time, this concludes our presentation. If any board members have any questions, we'd be happy to answer them. And if not, please just let us know.
Lexi, it's Ken down on the end. I don't expect you to make a legal ruling here, but I do want to talk about the second and third to last slide. Can we go back to the disclosure of confidential information?
Sure. Get that back up.
Yeah, there was a time in which this district became the subject of a state-ordered audit about its charter practices. Following that, there were some charges filed by the San Diego district attorney. Preceding that was a period of time in which several employees of the district were sworn to secrecy about testimony to a grand jury, including the point that they couldn't even discuss what they were being asked by the board, which kind of may have some implications about conduct of board members, and I won't get into all that. But there was a great deal of public commentary and now second guessing about why that wasn't being made available and what type of payment plans and God knows what. It's very clear to me here that if you are the subject of a grand jury investigation and you are called to be a witness, you are not to come back to your board when you're sworn not to come back to your board and advise them of what your testimony was. And I wanted to make sure that everybody that's watching this can look at that slide right there and understand that a little bit better. With that said, I have no more questions. I've made some comments along the way. Thank you for being very patient. This is as much for new board members as well as older board members or people with service that have gotten sloppy and kind of forgotten about things. But thank you for being patient with me. There's some things in here that should help the public understand about why we're not just ultimately responsive at the moment. So thank you both.
You're welcome.
Well, thank you.
No comments.
Just want to say thank you both for coming out tonight and doing a presentation. I appreciate it. Thank you.
You're very welcome.
It's our pleasure. Thank you.
Appreciate the response to our questions and helping us clarify that sometimes when we don't communicate, it's in everybody's best interest to go through the process and stay with the procedures. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thanks for the great presentation and all the slides. Thank you so much. With that, if I can get a motion to adjourn.